Imagine you're the most powerful ruler on earth, commanding the vast Persian Empire that stretches from India to the Mediterranean. A cocky young prince from what you consider a backwater kingdom has dared to invade your territory. But fortune has smiled upon you. Through brilliant maneuvering, you've managed to position your massive army behind this upstart, severing his connection to home, supplies, and any possibility of escape. He's cornered like a wild animal with nowhere to run. Your overwhelming forces surround him from multiple directions. Victory isn't just probable, it's guaranteed. Also, King Darius III believed in the autumn of 383 BC when he faced off against a 23-year-old Macedonian named Alexander. But before we dive into this incredible tale of tactical genius and royal hubris, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next in this story that literally changed the course of human civilization. What unfolded on the narrow coastal plains of Issus in November of 333 BC would shatter every assumption about warfare, leadership, and the very nature of power itself. This was not just another clash of bronze and iron in an age of endless conflict. This was a masterclass in military strategy, a symphony of violence so perfectly orchestrated that its principles would be studied with awe and reverence by generals and emperors for centuries to come. The young Alexander, a king whose name was just beginning to be whispered with a mixture of fear and wonder, was about to demonstrate a terrifying truth, that in the crucible of battle, sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted, the trap becomes a gift, and the mind of a single brilliant commander can be a weapon more powerful than 100,000 spears. The stage was set for one of history's most dramatic and consequential reversals of fortune. On one side stood Darius III, the King of Kings, inheritor of the Achaemenid Empire, a global superpower built over 2 centuries by legendary figures like Cyrus the Great. He was a man who commanded forces that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, a seemingly infinite reserve of manpower and wealth drawn from the heart of Asia. He was the defender of a world order, the guardian of a civilization that had known no equal. On the other side stood Alexander, leading a relatively small but ferociously loyal, battle-hardened army of Macedonians and Greeks, operating 1,000 miles from home at the razor's edge of their supply lines. He was not just an invader, he was a force of nature, driven by a restless divine ambition, what the Greeks called pothos, a yearning to go beyond the known edges of the map, to challenge fate itself. What happened next, in the mud and water of the Pinarus River, would determine not just the fate of 2 kingdoms, but the entire trajectory of Western civilization. To understand the magnitude of what was about to unfold at Issus, we need to first grasp the sheer, almost unimaginable scale of the Achaemenid Persian Empire that Darius commanded. This wasn't just another kingdom, it was the undisputed superpower of the ancient world, a vast, sophisticated political entity that had dominated the known world for over 200 years from its founding by Cyrus the Great. It was, in every sense, an empire upon which the sun never set. The Persian Empire stretched across 3 continents, a sprawling dominion that encompassed the territories of at least 20 modern-day countries. It included the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia in modern-day Iraq, the historic Anatolian kingdoms of modern Turkey, the timeless realm of the pharaohs in Egypt, and extended east into the mountains of Afghanistan, the plains of Pakistan, and parts of India and Central Asia. It was home to dozens of different peoples, languages and cultures: Babylonians, Egyptians, Jews, Lydians, Bactrians, and Greeks, all united under the overarching authority of the great king. The Persians had perfected the art of imperial administration, connecting their vast realm with the famous royal road, a highway system complete with relay stations that could transmit a royal message from one end of the empire to the other in a matter of days. This system of governance, based on provincial governors called satraps, allowed them to control territories spanning millions of square miles with remarkable efficiency. Darius III himself was no mere figurehead, no decadent ruler resting on the laurels of his ancestors. He had come to the throne through a period of intense and bloody court intrigue, proving his own personal courage and martial prowess in the process. The historian Diodorus tells us of a time before he was king, when Darius, serving in a campaign, accepted a challenge of single combat against a fearsome champion of the rebellious Cadutian tribe. He defeated and killed the champion in a spectacular duel, winning great honour and the favour of the then king. He was a proven warrior, a respected administrator, and a man determined to prove himself a worthy successor to the likes of Cyrus and Darius the Great. He was not a coward by nature. He was a king who understood his duty to defend his realm. The military machine he commanded was legendary. At its heart were the famous Immortals, 10,000 elite heavy infantry who served as the king's personal bodyguard and the iron backbone of Persian military might. Their name came from the fact that their number was always kept at exactly 10,000. If one fell in battle, he was immediately replaced, creating the illusion of an invincible, undying unit. These weren't just soldiers. They were the cream of Persian and Median nobility, equipped with the finest weapons and scale armour the empire could provide, their spears adorned with silver and gold pomegranates to signify their rank. Beyond the Immortals, Darius could call upon an almost endless variety of troops. He had access to the finest cavalry units in the world, from the heavily armoured horsemen of the eastern steppes to the swift skirmishers of Cappadocia. His infantry included disciplined archers from Persia proper and hardy spearmen from the mountains of Media. He could also call upon auxiliary forces from dozens of subject nations, and crucially, he had the wealth to hire the best professional soldiers money could buy. Thousands of Greek mercenary hoplites, hardened veterans who were considered the only infantry in the world who could stand face to face with Alexander's phalanx. But perhaps most importantly, Darius commanded virtually unlimited financial resources. The imperial treasuries at Susa, Persepolis, and Babylon were filled with the accumulated tribute of conquered peoples, the profits from the empire's extensive trade networks, and the output of gold and silver mines scattered across his domains. This immense wealth allowed him to maintain standing armies, hired tens of thousands of mercenaries, and sustain military campaigns for years if necessary. Against this colossal, wealthy, and seemingly inexhaustible empire, Alexander's small kingdom of Macedonia seemed like little more than a gnat challenging a lion. Against this imperial colossus stood Alexander of Macedon, a 23-year-old king who had inherited a kingdom that many sophisticated Persians considered little more than a collection of rustic mountain villages on the barbaric fringe of the civilized Greek world. And in many ways, they were right. Macedonia was indeed a small, rugged realm, historically overshadowed by the great city-states of Athens, Sparta, and Thebes. But what it lacked in size and wealth, it more than made up for in military innovation, martial spirit, and the sheer, earth-shaking ambition of its royal house. Alexander had inherited more than just a throne from his brilliant one-eyed father Philip II. He had inherited a military revolution, Over a reign of 2 decades, Philip had taken the disorganized, semi-tribal levies of Macedonia and forged them into the most advanced and lethal professional army the world had ever seen. He had observed the weaknesses in the traditional Greek way of war, the reliance on short seasonal campaigns fought by citizen amateurs, and created something entirely new. He transformed warfare from a ritual into a science, creating new formations, new weapons, and new tactical doctrines that would prove devastatingly effective against larger, more traditional armies. The heart of Alexander's military machine, its unbreakable anvil, was the Macedonian phalanx. This was not the traditional Greek phalanx of hoplites with their large shields and short spears. Philip's infantry carried a much smaller shield, freeing up both hands to wield the fearsome 18-foot pike known as the sarissa. This weapon was so long that the points of the first 5 ranks of soldiers projected beyond the front of the formation. When these men locked their shields and lowered their spears, they created an almost impenetrable wall of sharpened iron points, a giant, disciplined hedgehog of death that could advance steadily forward, grinding down any enemy resistance through sheer momentum and its ability to kill from a distance. But Alexander's true tactical advantage, the hammer to the phalanx's anvil, lay in his cavalry, particularly the elite companion cavalry that he led personally. These were not just mounted warriors, they were the sons of the Macedonian nobility, the finest heavy cavalry in the world, trained from childhood in the arts of horsemanship and warfare. Armed with the deadly 12-foot Ziston lance, they fought in a revolutionary wedge formation that could concentrate maximum force at a single point, allowing them to punch through enemy lines like a spear through cloth, creating gaps that Alexander's other units could then exploit with lethal efficiency. This combined arms system of a holding force, the phalanx, and a striking force, the cavalry, was the secret to Macedonian battlefield dominance. What made Alexander truly dangerous, however, wasn't just the army he inherited. It was his personal leadership style, his almost supernatural ability to read the chaos of a battlefield like others read scrolls, and his almost insane appetite for personal risk. He did not command from a safe position in the rear. He led from the very front, charging at the head of his companions, his distinctive plumed helmet a beacon for both his own men and the enemy. He shared the dangers, the wounds and the hardships of his soldiers, and in doing so he inspired a fanatical personal loyalty that no mercenary army could ever hope to match. His soldiers didn't just follow him because he was their king. They followed him because they had seen him perform impossible feats with their own eyes, because they believed he was touched by the gods, that he was, in fact, invincible. Alexander's invasion of the Persian Empire hadn't begun at Issus. It was the culmination of a long and bloody road, a carefully planned campaign that had already delivered stunning victories and established the young king as a force to be reckoned with. His first major triumph had come over a year earlier, in 334 BC, at the Granicus River. There, against the advice of his cautious older generals, Alexander had led a seemingly suicidal cavalry charge across a fast-flowing river, up a steep and muddy bank, and directly into the teeth of a prepared Persian defensive line. He had fought in the front ranks, nearly losing his own life, and in a single, brutal afternoon, had shattered the army of the Persian satraps of Asia Minor. This victory was more than just a military success. It was a thunderous announcement of his arrival, a clear and bloody message to the great king that a serious threat had landed on his shores. Following that victory, Alexander had spent more than a year methodically consolidating his control over Asia Minor. He marched down the Ionian coast, liberating the ancient Greek cities from Persian rule, not as a conqueror, but as a cultural hero. He then pushed into the rugged interior, a campaign that culminated in the legendary episode at Gordium. There, he was shown an ancient chariot with an impossibly complex knot. An ancient prophecy held that whoever could untie the Gordian knot would become the ruler of all Asia. After struggling with it briefly, Alexander, in a display of his characteristic direct approach, declared, "It matters not how it is loosed," and with a single powerful stroke of his sword cut the knot in half. For his men and for the world, the symbolism was unmistakable. This was a man of destiny who did not follow the old rules but made his own. This systematic preparation, securing ports, winning allies, and building his own myth, was crucial for building the logistical base he would need for deeper penetration into the heart of the empire. During this time, Darius, in his magnificent palace at Babylon, had been watching and planning. Initially, he had dismissed Alexander as just another Greek troublemaker, a minor nuisance to be dealt with by his local governors and their hired mercenaries. The loss at the Granica was embarrassing, but it was seen as a regional defeat, not a threat to the empire itself. But as reports of Macedonian victories continued to reach his court, as city after city fell, as the legend of the Gordian knot spread, the great king realized he was facing something unprecedented. This wasn't just a raid for plunder or a limited incursion to free a few Greek cities. Alexander's ambition was total. He seemed intent on conquering the entire Persian Empire. The decision for the great king to personally lead an army against Alexander was a momentous one. In the Achaemenid tradition, great kings didn't typically take the field unless the very existence of the empire was at stake. Their presence on the battlefield signified that this was not a border dispute, but a final, existential struggle. By mobilizing the imperial army and marching west from Babylon, Darius was acknowledging to the entire world that Alexander represented a mortal threat to Persian power, a threat that could no longer be delegated to lesser commanders. The army Darius assembled was massive even by Persian standards, a force designed not just to defeat Alexander, but to utterly annihilate him. He drew troops from across the empire, calling in levies from satrapies in the Far East that hadn't seen a major war in generations. Tens of thousands of professional Greek mercenaries were hired to provide a solid, disciplined infantry corps. Persian nobles, as was their duty, brought their personal retainers and cavalry squadrons. The result was a force that ancient sources claim numbered over 500,000 men. While a modern estimate of 100,000 is more realistic, it was still a colossal host. It was a moving city of warriors, support personnel, royal courtiers, and hangers-on that stretched for miles across the landscape, a terrifying and awe-inspiring symbol of the Persian Empire's seemingly limitless power. The initial movements of both armies represented a masterclass in strategic maneuvering, a high-stakes game of cat and mouse played across the mountainous terrain of northern Syria. But this intricate dance also set the stage for one of the most consequential and improbable mistakes in all of military history. Alexander, his army weakened by a severe fever that had nearly claimed his own life, had recovered and was now driven by an almost desperate need to bring Darius to a decisive battle. He pushed his army south through a narrow mountain pass known as the Syrian Gates, which provided access to the wide open plains of the Syrian heartland. This was aggressive, audacious generalship at its finest. Instead of waiting for the colossal Persian army to come to him, where they could choose the ground, Alexander was actively seeking a confrontation, trusting in the speed and superior quality of his veteran troops. Darius, meanwhile, was camped with his massive army on the wide plains of Syria, on the other side of the Amanus mountain range. Advised by his experienced Greek mercenary commanders, he was waiting for Alexander to emerge from the mountains, intending to crush the smaller Macedonian force on the open ground where his overwhelming numbers and powerful cavalry would be decisive. But Darius was an impatient man, surrounded by fawning courtiers who assured him that Alexander was terrified and possibly in retreat. Ignoring the sound advice of his generals to simply wait, Darius made a fateful decision. He broke camp and chose a different route, leading his massive army north and then west through a separate mountain pass known as the Ammanic Gates. His plan, sound in theory, was to emerge behind Alexander's line of march. By cutting the Macedonian supply lines and blocking his only route of retreat, Darius could trap Alexander against the sea and force the Macedonians to either surrender or turn and fight on Persian terms. What happened next was almost farcical in its sheer improbability. Screened from each other by the rugged peaks of the Amanus Mountains, the two greatest armies of the ancient world, both actively seeking each other out, managed to completely miss their encounter. Like two great ships passing in a storm, Alexander's army marched south along the western side of the mountains, while Darius's much larger force marched north along the eastern side. Neither commander had adequate reconnaissance in the difficult terrain, and neither realized what had occurred until it was far too late to easily rectify the situation. For Darius, the realization that he now stood behind Alexander's army must have seemed like a gift from the gods, a sign of his divine right to rule. He had brilliantly and successfully outmaneuvered his celebrated opponent. His forces descended from the mountains and captured the town of Issus, which Alexander had just left behind to serve as his rear base and hospital. In an act of shocking brutality that revealed his growing frustration and arrogance, Darius ordered the sick and wounded Macedonian soldiers who had been left there to be tortured, mutilated, and then executed. He wanted to send a message of terror to the man who defied him. The psychological impact of his position was, he believed, total. Alexander's army was now completely cut off from its supply lines, isolated from its bases in Asia Minor, and with no hope of reinforcement or resupply. The young Macedonian upstart was cornered, surrounded deep in enemy territory. The trap was sprung. Victory, Darius and his commanders believed, was now a mere formality. The tension is building, isn't it? This is where the story gets absolutely incredible. Before we reveal how Alexander turned this seemingly impossible situation to his advantage, take a moment to like this video if you're enjoying this epic tale of ancient warfare. Your support helps us bring you more incredible stories from history. When Alexander's reconnaissance cavalry, sent back on a hunch, returned at a full gallop with the shocking news that Darius's entire colossal army was now behind them, occupying their rear, the initial reaction throughout the Macedonian camp was one of cold, stomach-churning terror. The strategic situation had reversed in an instant. They were no longer the hunters, they were the hunted. They were trapped, isolated, 1,000 miles from home, with a massive, vengeful Persian army blocking their only escape route. Panic began to ripple through the ranks. Even Alexander's most senior and experienced officers, grizzled veterans of 100 battles, were shaken. They gathered in hushed, worried groups discussing the seemingly hopeless situation, with some beginning to talk of the unthinkable, negotiating terms of surrender or attempting a suicidal fighting withdrawal back through the mountain passes. But Alexander himself had an entirely different reaction. The historians tell us that as his commanders debated their doom, Alexander, upon hearing the news, let out a cry of pure, unadulterated joy. Where his men saw disaster, he saw a divine opportunity. Where his most trusted advisors perceived a fatal trap, he recognized a gift from the gods, a miraculous turn of events that would allow him to achieve something that might otherwise have been impossible. A final, decisive confrontation with Darius himself, not on the wide-open plains where Persian numbers would be overwhelming, but here, in this constricted space, on ground of Alexander's choosing. Gathering his terrified commanders, his face alight with a confidence that must have seemed like madness, Alexander delivered a speech that has echoed through history. He did not downplay the danger, he redefined it. The gods themselves, he declared, are on our side, for they have put it into the mind of Darius to abandon the open plains and to cram his great host into this narrow space between the mountains and the sea. He explained with piercing clarity what this meant. Darius, in his arrogance and impatience, had willingly sacrificed his single greatest advantage. The battle would not be decided by who had more men, but by who had the better men. And in that contest, Alexander had no doubt of the outcome. This wasn't mere bravado. It was the product of a supreme tactical intellect. Alexander understood something that Darius, in his eagerness to spring the trap, had failed to grasp, that the narrow coastal plain of Issus would act as a great equalizer. It would prevent the Persians from deploying their full strength, from using their cavalry to envelop his flanks. Instead of facing 100,000 enemies at once, his small elite army would be fighting only those Persians who could actually fit into the constricted battle line. Darius had not trapped Alexander's army, he had trapped his own. The psychological impact of Alexander's unshakable confidence on his own troops was immediate and dramatic. Fear was replaced by a surge of adrenaline and renewed purpose. Instead of dwelling on their dangerous, isolated situation, the Macedonians began to focus on the glorious opportunity before them. Their king, the demigod they had followed to the edge of the world, had just told them that victory was not just possible, but divinely assured. They were no longer trapped animals waiting for the slaughter. They were the instruments of fate, about to face the great king himself in a battle for the world, a battle their own king was telling them they could not possibly lose. With their morale restored and their purpose clear, Alexander gave the order to turn the army around and march north to meet their destiny. The narrow plain of Issus was perhaps the worst possible terrain in the region for deploying a massive cavalry-heavy army. But Darius had committed himself to fighting there, and now had to make the best of a strategically disastrous situation. The battlefield was barely 1.5 miles wide, a cramped corridor of land squeezed tightly between the impassable Amanus Mountains on one side and the shores of the Mediterranean Sea on the other. Running diagonally through the middle of this already constricted space was the Pinarus River. Though not particularly deep, its steep, slippery banks and stony riverbed would serve as a natural defensive line, a formidable obstacle that could disrupt the cohesion of any attacking force. Darius, despite his initial blunder, deployed his forces with the careful attention to detail that Persian military doctrine demanded. To make the river an even stronger defence, he ordered his men to construct palisades and earthworks along the sections of the riverbank where the crossing was easiest. His deployment was a classic defensive setup, designed to absorb the Macedonian charge and then destroy it with overwhelming numbers. His centre, the anchor of his entire line, was held by his most reliable and professional troops, 30,000 Greek mercenary hoplites. These were hardened veterans from across the Greek world who fought for Persian gold. They were positioned in a deep, solid formation directly along the riverbank, where they could use the natural obstacle to break the momentum of the Macedonian phalanx's assault. The Persian right wing, extending to the coast where the ground was flattest, was where Darius placed the bulk of his finest cavalry units. This was the traditional position of strength in Persian deployments, and the open ground near the sea was ideal for the sweeping mounted operations at which they excelled. Here thousands of Persian noble cavalry, heavily armoured horsemen from Media, and auxiliary squadrons from across the empire prepared to shatter the Macedonian left flank, sweep around behind their army, and deliver the decisive battle-winning blow. The Persian left wing, a massive force stretching from the centre up into the rocky foothills of the mountains, was packed with tens of thousands of lighter infantry units called kardakis. These were not the elite troops of the army, but they were numerous, well-equipped, and more than adequate for holding their ground against what the Persians expected to be a desperate Macedonian assault. Their job was simply to hold the line and pin Alexander's best troops in place. Most significantly, Darius himself, in accordance with Persian royal tradition, took his position in the absolute centre of the line, mounted on his magnificent war chariot. He was surrounded by his personal guard, the 10,000 elite warriors known as the Immortals, and the finest of his kinsman cavalry. This wasn't just a ceremonial placement. It was a powerful statement of royal confidence, and a guarantee that the great king would personally oversee what he believed would be the final, glorious destruction of the Macedonian upstart. From this central vantage point, he would command his seemingly invincible host to a victory that would secure his throne and his legacy forever. As Alexander's army advanced, he deployed his own forces with the fluid, adaptive brilliance that would make him one of history's greatest military commanders. Unlike Darius, who was essentially trying to fit a square peg into a round hole by cramming his massive army into an inadequate space, Alexander saw the terrain not as a limitation, but as an opportunity. He crafted a battle plan specifically designed to exploit the unique, constricted characteristics of the Issus battlefield, turning the narrow ground into a weapon that would work for him. On his left flank, directly facing the most powerful concentration of Persian cavalry near the coast, Alexander placed his allied Greek and Thessalian cavalry squadrons. This force was under the command of Parmenion, his most trusted, cautious, and experienced general. Parmenion's task was arguably the most difficult of the entire battle. He was dangerously outnumbered and facing the elite of the Persian horsemen on the ground most favourable to them. But Alexander's instructions to him were telling. He was not expected to win on that flank. His orders were simply to hold his ground at all costs, to bend but not to break, and to prevent a Persian breakthrough for as long as humanly possible. This was a crucial defensive anchor, acknowledging the Persian advantage on that part of the field, while trusting his most reliable general to perform a vital holding action. Alexander's centre was occupied by the unbreakable heart of his army, the 6 battalions of the Macedonian phalanx. These heavily armoured infantrymen, hardened veterans of a dozen campaigns, formed a solid, disciplined wall of steel points. Armed with their fearsome 18-foot sarissas, they would advance in perfect order across the difficult terrain of the Pinarus River, trusting in their superior equipment, their relentless training, and their proven ability to grind down any enemy infantry that stood before them. Their job was to fix the Persian centre, the Greek mercenaries, in place, and slowly, inexorably, destroy them. But it was on Alexander's right wing, stretching from the phalanx towards the foothills of the mountains, that his true, aggressive intentions became clear. Here he massed his elite, offensive units. He positioned his hyperspists, the royal shield bearers, his elite light infantry who could fight in both the phalanx and in more open order. He placed his archers and his elite Agrianian javelin men, the best skirmishers in the ancient world, and at the far right he positioned his ultimate striking force, the hammer of his army, the elite companion cavalry, which he would lead personally into battle. This was not a defensive flank. It was designed from the outset to be his primary offensive weapon, the spearhead that would deliver the decisive battle-winning blow. As he surveyed the vast Persian line, he noticed that their left wing extended much further up into the foothills than his own forces could match, creating a serious threat of envelopment. In response, Alexander made a final brilliant tactical adjustment. He held back a portion of his light infantry and cavalry at a 45-degree angle behind his right wing, creating what military historians call a refused flank, or a flank guard in echelon. This was a revolutionary and flexible formation. It could act as a defensive hinge, ready to pivot and counter any Persian attempt to outflank him from the mountains. But it could also act as a reserve, ready to be committed to the main attack at the decisive moment. With his dispositions made, Alexander rode along the entire front of his army, calling out to his commanders and even to individual soldiers by name, his presence and his supreme confidence a final, electrifying tonic for his men before they advanced into the jaws of a battle they were outnumbered in, but one he had already decided they would win. When Alexander finally gave the order to advance, his entire army began to move forward with the disciplined, almost silent precision that so terrified their enemies. But characteristically, the young king didn't simply order a general charge straight ahead into the teeth of the prepared Persian defences. Instead, he initiated his attack with an ingenious diagonal advance, a manoeuvre designed to create confusion, probe for weaknesses, and force the enemy to react to him. He personally led his right wing, the companions and hypaspists, not directly towards the river, but at an oblique angle, moving steadily to his right, parallel to the Persian line. This oblique approach was vintage Alexander, aggressive, unconventional, and deeply unsettling for his opponents. The Persians watched as Alexander's elite units seemed to be drifting away from the main battle, moving towards the foothills of the mountains. Was he attempting a massive, risky flanking maneuver? Was he trying to draw them out? This sense of menace and unpredictability forced the Persian commanders on that flank to react. They could not simply stand and watch as Alexander's best troops moved to get around their line. The Persian infantry stationed on their left flank, the lightly armed Kardakis who were packed into the foothills, saw this sideways movement and feared they were about to be outflanked and enveloped. On their own initiative, or on the panicked orders of a local commander, they did exactly what Alexander had hoped they would do. They abandoned their strong, elevated defensive positions and charged down from the heights to intercept Alexander's cavalry, hoping to pin them against the river. In doing so, they disrupted their own carefully arranged formation, lost the advantage of high ground, and most critically began to open a gap between themselves and the Greek mercenaries holding the Persian centre. The moment the Persian left began to move, to break its cohesion, Alexander knew his opportunity had come. With a single trumpet blast he gave the order. He immediately wheeled the companion cavalry from their diagonal march into their devastating wedge formation, a tactical innovation that concentrated the power of hundreds of horses and lances into a single, piercing point, while still allowing for remarkable control and cohesion. What followed was one of the most famous and decisive cavalry charges in military history. With a loud war cry to his divine ancestor Heracles, Alexander spurred Bucephalus forward, leading his horsemen not at the Cardaces, who had charged down from the hills, but at the now exposed flank of the Persian left centre. He led his companions directly into and across the Pinarus River, ignoring the difficult terrain, and smashed with overwhelming force into the flank of the Persian line. The psychological and physical impact on the lightly armed Cardacs was catastrophic. These troops, adequate for holding a defensive position, were completely unprepared for a flank assault by the finest, most feared heavy cavalry in the world, led by a king who fought like a vengeful god. Their line and their nerve shattered instantly. While Alexander was achieving his spectacular breakthrough on the right wing, a desperate and bloody crisis was unfolding in the centre of the battlefield. The situation here was far more precarious. The Macedonian phalanx, the unbreakable heart of Alexander's army, found itself attempting to cross the Pinarus River while maintaining its rigid, carefully drilled formation, a near impossible task. The river's steep, slippery and muddy banks, combined with the uneven, stony riverbed, shattered their cohesion. The perfect interlocking wall of shields and sarissas dissolved into fragmented, struggling battalions. Men slipped and fell in the churning water, their long pikes becoming unwieldy encumbrances. All the while, they were under constant harassing fire from Persian archers and javelin throwers positioned on the opposite bank. As the Macedonians, wet, disorganized and exhausted, finally struggled up the far bank of the river, still trying to reform their lines, they were met by a solid wall of professional killers. Here stood Darius's best infantry, 30,000 Greek mercenaries, the backbone of the Persian centre. What followed was not a quick, decisive charge, but a brutal, grinding, shield-to-shield shoving match, a horrific infantry battle known as the Othismos, that would determine the fate of empires. These Greek mercenaries were not intimidated. They were experienced professional soldiers, men who had fought in vicious intercity wars across the Greek world. They understood Macedonian tactics intimately and held no particular awe for the reputation of Alexander's phalanx. More importantly, they held every tactical advantage. They were fighting on dry, stable ground from prepared, fortified positions against an enemy who was still scrambling to reform its lines after a difficult river crossing. They were fresh, and the Macedonians were weary. For several terrifying, heart-stopping minutes, it appeared that the Macedonian advance would be stopped cold and then annihilated. The phalanx battalions, unable to properly bring the full weight of their sarissas to bear, found themselves pressed hard by opponents who matched their professionalism and discipline and significantly exceeded their numbers. The brutal shoving match was a contest of pure, grinding attrition. Shields splintered, spears snapped, and men screamed as the two lines mashed against each other. Individual Macedonian units, taking heavy casualties, began to give ground. Gaps, a fatal weakness for a phalanx, started to appear in what had previously been an unbroken line of steel points. One battalion commanded by Ptolemy was nearly wiped out, its commander killed in the brutal melee. This was the moment of maximum danger for Alexander's entire army. The anchor of his battle line, the force upon which his entire strategy depended, was on the verge of collapsing. If the centre broke, the Greek mercenaries could pour through the gap, rolling up both of Alexander's flanks and achieving the decisive, overwhelming victory that Darius had anticipated. The fate of the battle, Alexander's life, and perhaps the entire course of his invasion, hung precariously in the balance as his exhausted Macedonian pikemen struggled desperately to maintain their footing against the ferocious and determined resistance of their countrymen fighting for Persian gold. What happened next demonstrated why Alexander deserved his reputation as one of history's greatest battlefield commanders, a leader who possessed not just brute courage, but an almost supernatural sense of timing and battlefield awareness. Having achieved his spectacular breakthrough against the Persian left wing, a lesser, glory-seeking general might have impulsively pursued the thousands of fleeing enemy troops, chasing them for miles into the hills and claiming an easy, glorious local victory. But Alexander was not a lesser general. With a glance back over his shoulder, he saw the crisis unfolding in the centre. He saw his own phalanx, his unbreakable anvil, buckling and on the verge of shattering. He possessed the incredible tactical discipline to recognize that the real, decisive battle was still being fought and lost in the bloody grind along the river bank. Ignoring the temptation of a glorious pursuit, Alexander reined in his horse, his trumpet sounding the signal to rally. With shouts and hand signals, he rallied the victorious companion cavalry, pulling them back from the intoxicating thrill of the chase. He wheeled his entire elite squadron around, their horses churning the muddy ground for a second, even more critical charge. This time, his target wasn't the already broken Persian left wing, but the exposed, vulnerable flank of the Greek mercenaries who were so dangerously close to breaking his own phalanx. The impact of this second cavalry charge was devastating and immediate. The Greek mercenaries, their entire focus and energy committed to the brutal head-on shoving match with the Macedonian infantry, had no reserves, no warning, and no defence against this sudden, thunderous assault from their side. They were caught in a perfect trap, attacked simultaneously from the front by the irresistible pressure of the sarissa pikes, and from the flank by the finest heavy cavalry in the world. Their disciplined professional formation, which had been on the verge of victory just moments before, began to buckle and then crumble into chaos. This was the turning point of the entire battle. The anchor of Darius's army had been broken. With his elite centre units now collapsing and his left wing already routed and fleeing for the mountains, Darius, watching from his chariot, could see his carefully planned victory dissolving into a nightmare of chaos and slaughter. But Alexander wasn't finished. Having broken the mercenary line and saved his own infantry, he rallied his companions for a third, final and relentless cavalry charge. This one was not aimed at a flank or a crumbling line. This one was aimed like a spear directly at the heart of the Persian command, at the great king himself. The sight of Alexander, his armour now covered in the dust and blood of battle, his face a mask of furious determination, reforming his victorious cavalry and leading them straight toward the royal position, was more than Darius could bear. The great king, who had come to the battlefield expecting to watch the clinical destruction of a barbarian upstart, now found himself face to face with a warrior whose tactical brilliance and seemingly divine fury had just systematically destroyed 2/3 of his magnificent army. The whirlwind of battle was no longer a distant spectacle. It was coming directly for him. The moment when Darius III, the King of Kings, ruler of the world's greatest empire, turned his magnificent royal chariot and fled the battlefield was one of the most consequential acts of cowardice in all of ancient history. It wasn't just the retreat of an individual ruler in fear for his life. It was the catastrophic collapse of the entire Persian command structure and the final, irrevocable signal for a complete military disaster. His personal terror became his empire's death warrant. Persian military doctrine, and indeed their entire imperial ideology, placed enormous, almost mystical emphasis on the person of the great king. He wasn't just a commander-in-chief in the modern sense, he was the living embodiment of imperial authority, the centre of the Persian universe, and the chosen representative of the god Ahura Mazda on earth. His presence on the battlefield was a sacred guarantee of divine favour. When his soldiers, from 100 different lands and speaking 100 different languages, saw their divine king fleeing in abject panic, the message was unambiguous and soul-crushing. The gods themselves had abandoned the Persian cause. For them, continuing to fight was not just futile, it was potentially sacrilegious, an act of defiance against a now obvious divine judgment. The psychological impact of Darius's flight spread through the remaining Persian ranks like wildfire. On the Persian right, where the elite cavalry had been on the verge of breaking Parmenion's flank, the commanders suddenly saw the royal standard disappearing in a cloud of dust. Units that had been fighting effectively, even winning their part of the battle, suddenly found themselves leaderless and demoralized. The carefully maintained discipline that held the massive multi-ethnic Persian army together dissolved almost instantly. It was replaced by a contagious individual panic and the desperate primal desire for self-preservation. What had been an organized, centrally commanded military force became a terrified, headless mob in a matter of moments. Tens of thousands of Persian soldiers, many of whom had never even engaged the enemy, having been held in the rear ranks, saw the chaos unfolding before them, saw the flight of their king, and simply threw down their heavy shields and weapons and ran for their lives. The narrow plain of Issus, the very terrain Darius had chosen to trap Alexander, now became a horrific death trap for his own fleeing army. The fleeing Persians, their formations broken, found themselves bottlenecked between the impassable mountains and the unforgiving sea, with nowhere to escape the vengeful, pursuing Macedonians who now owned the battlefield. The collapse of Persian resistance at Issus was total, catastrophic, and shockingly swift. On the left wing, where Alexander had achieved his initial breakthrough, the terrified Cardaces were already streaming towards the safety of the mountains in complete and utter disorder, hunted down by Alexander's light infantry. In the centre, the professional Greek mercenaries who had fought so valiantly and had come so close to breaking the Macedonian phalanx were now completely surrounded. With their paymaster gone and their formation shattered, they were caught in a hopeless position between the relentlessly advancing sarissa pikes of the Macedonian phalanx to their front and the vengeful charge of Alexander's returning companion cavalry to their rear. For them, there was no escape, only a brutal annihilation or the humiliation of surrender. Even on the Persian right wing, where Mazaeus' cavalry had been performing so well, the flight of the great king triggered an immediate and irreversible collapse. The Persian horsemen, who'd been preparing for what they believed would be a battle-winning assault on the Macedonian left, suddenly found themselves leaderless, their central command having evaporated. They were now facing an enemy who was no longer concerned with desperate defence. Parmenion, seeing the Persian line waver, seized the moment. His superb Thessalian cavalry, having successfully held their ground through hours of brutal fighting, now launched their own ferocious counterattack. They smashed into the disorganized and demoralized Persian horsemen, turning what had been a near victory for the Persians into another chaotic, bloody rout. The casualties from the battle were staggering and grotesquely one-sided. While Alexander's army, according to ancient sources, may have lost only a few hundred men, a testament to the speed and decisiveness of his victory, The Persian losses numbered in the tens of thousands. The narrow plain and the banks of the Pinarus River were choked with the bodies of men and horses. More importantly than the raw numbers was who those losses represented. Alexander had not just defeated a provincial levy, he had annihilated the grand army of the Persian Empire, killing many of the noble cavalry and elite infantry commanders who formed the very backbone of the Persian military system. It was a blow from which the empire's military prestige would never recover. But the material consequences of the victory extended far beyond the battlefield casualties. In his panicked haste to escape, Darius had abandoned not just his army, but everything else that defined his royal power. When the victorious Macedonians entered the opulent Persian camp, they were stunned by what they found. Left behind was an enormous treasure, a king's ransom in gold and silver coins and bullion that represented years of imperial tax collection and tribute payments. Alexander had just acquired the financial resources to fund his campaigns for the foreseeable future, freeing him from any reliance on his distant homeland. The conqueror, in a single afternoon, had become the wealthiest man in the world. Even more significant than the mountains of captured treasure was another priceless prize that Darius had abandoned in his panicked flight, his own family. Left behind in the chaos of the royal camp were his mother, the formidable Queen Mother Sisygambis, his beautiful wife Statera, his young son and heir, and his daughters. In the ancient world, these weren't just family members. They were powerful symbols of imperial legitimacy, the living embodiment of the Achaemenid dynasty's right to rule. In Darius's hands they were his family. In Alexander's hands they were the keys to an empire. Alexander's treatment of the captured royal family in the immediate aftermath of the bloody battle revealed a political sophistication and a masterful understanding of psychological warfare that was perhaps even more brilliant than his battlefield tactics. Hearing that the royal women were in his camp and believed that Darius was dead and that they were to be executed or dishonored, Alexander immediately sent a messenger to assure them of their safety and their king's survival. He then, in a gesture of profound respect, went to visit them himself, accompanied by his closest friend and general Hephaestion. What happened next is one of the most famous and revealing anecdotes of Alexander's life. Upon his entrance, Darius's mother, Sisygambis, overwhelmed by grief and fear, mistook the taller and, by some accounts, more handsome Hephaestion for the king, and prostrated herself before him. As Hephaestion stepped back in embarrassment and his guards moved to correct her, Alexander simply helped the old queen to her feet and said with incredible grace, "Do not worry, mother, you are not mistaken, for he too is Alexander." With this single, brilliant statement, he not only spared her any humiliation, but elevated his friend to the status of his equal, a profound sign of his affection, and a demonstration of a magnanimity that was utterly alien to the rigid hierarchies of the Persian court. This was not just chivalry, it was calculated and masterful policy. He assured the royal women that they would be treated not as prisoners or hostages, but with all the honour and respect due to their royal status, promising to care for them as if he were their own son. This act of clemency was a devastating propaganda weapon. The contrast with Darius could not have been more stark or more damaging to the great king's prestige. Here was the King of Kings, who had twice fled the battlefield, abandoning his armies and now his own family, while the young Macedonian barbarian was treating Persian royalty with more honour and compassion than their own ruler had shown. The story of this encounter would spread like wildfire throughout the Persian Empire, doing more to undermine Darius's legitimacy than any military defeat. Alexander's magnanimous treatment of the royal captives also served another crucial, forward-thinking purpose. It sent a clear and powerful message to the Persian nobles, satraps, and city governors who still stood in his path. Surrender to Alexander did not necessarily mean death or destruction. It signalled that he was not merely a destructive invader, but a potential and worthy successor to the Persian throne, one who understood and respected the traditions of empire. This policy of clemency towards willing collaborators would prove absolutely essential in the coming years as he pushed deeper and deeper into the Persian heartland, encouraging cities and provinces to open their gates to him rather than resist to the last man. The Battle of Issus was more than just another victory. It was a fundamental, world-altering event that completely transformed the entire strategic situation in the Eastern Mediterranean. Before the battle, Alexander had been a brilliant but vulnerable invader. He was operating at the end of perilously long supply lines, 1,000 miles from home, always susceptible to being cut off or ground down by the seemingly limitless resources of the Persian Empire. After the battle, he had become something else entirely. He was no longer just an invader. He was a conqueror with the financial resources, the military momentum, and now, through his treatment of the royal family, the burgeoning legitimacy to challenge Persian power throughout its vast domains. The immediate strategic benefits were enormous and cascaded with breathtaking speed. With Darius's grand army utterly destroyed, and the great king himself a discredited fugitive, the entire Persian defensive system in the western half of the empire collapsed. The rich province of Syria, with its ancient cities and vital trade routes, now lay open to Macedonian conquest. More importantly, the wealthy and powerful Phoenician cities along the coast, Byblos, Sidon, and eventually Tyre, were now within his grasp. By capturing these great naval bases, Alexander could achieve a crucial strategic objective: the neutralization of the Persian fleet. Without friendly ports to resupply, the Persian navy, which had once threatened to cut his lines of communication back to Greece, would wither on the vine, effectively ceding control of the entire Mediterranean to him. Furthermore, the path to Egypt, the wealthiest and most ancient province of the Persian Empire, was now clear. The Egyptians, who had a long and bitter history of resenting Persian rule, could now be approached not as a conqueror demanding submission, but as a liberator offering freedom from their overlords. The victory at Issus gave Alexander the keys to the entire western portion of Darius's empire. But perhaps most importantly, Alexander had demonstrated something that had seemed impossible to the world before Issus. He had proven, in a direct head-to-head confrontation, that the colossal military power of the Persian Empire could be decisively defeated by a relatively small but brilliantly led and highly motivated army. This stunning revelation would echo like a thunderclap across the Persian Empire. It would encourage restive populations to rebel against their Persian masters, and would make it infinitely easier for Alexander to recruit local allies and auxiliaries for his future campaigns. Why remain loyal to a losing empire when you could join the side of a seemingly invincible, God-blessed conqueror? The psychological impact of the battle extended far beyond military considerations, and struck at the very heart of Persian imperial authority. Darius was no longer the remote, invincible, semi-divine great king ruling by the mandate of Ahura Mazda. He was now a man who had twice fled from battle, a commander who had abandoned not just his armies, but his own mother, wife, and children to save himself. His authority, his prestige, and his very right to rule were now open to question in every satrap's court from Babylon to Bactria. ambitious provincial governors and powerful generals would now begin to quietly calculate whether their future interests lay with a discredited fleeing king or with a charismatic, victorious, and seemingly unstoppable young conqueror from the west. The seeds of the empire's final internal collapse had been sown in the mud of the Pinarus River. The Battle of Issus stands as one of the most remarkable and complete reversals of fortune in all of military history. What began as a carefully laid Persian trap, a strategic checkmate that should have ended Alexander's invasion, instead became the very foundation of his eventual conquest of the entire Persian Empire, through a breathtaking combination of tactical brilliance, unwavering self-confidence, personal courage, and an almost supernatural ability to read the flow of battle. Alexander had not just escaped the trap, he had turned it back on his opponent, transforming a moment of certain defeat into an overwhelming and world-changing victory. The young king, who had seemed trapped, isolated and helpless just hours before, was now the undisputed master of the battlefield. He was the possessor of the Persian royal family, the symbolic keys to the empire, and a treasury so vast it would fuel his future conquests all the way to the shores of India. In stark contrast, Darius, the mighty king of kings who had come to Issus, expecting to swat a barbarian upstart, was now a discredited and dishonoured fugitive, a ruler whose very legitimacy had been shattered by his conduct on the battlefield. The hunter had not just become the hunted, he had lost his kingdom in the process. This wasn't just another ancient battle. It was the moment when the balance of power in the ancient world, a balance that had held for over 2 centuries, shifted irrevocably. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, the superpower that had dominated the known world from the Danube to the Indus, was now facing an existential challenge from an enemy who had proven capable of defeating its best troops, outmaneuvering its most experienced commanders, and breaking the will of its great king. The myth of Persian invincibility, already cracked at the Granicus, was now shattered beyond repair. Alexander's victory at Issus was the key that unlocked the rest of the world for him. It opened the path to the vital ports of Syria and Phoenicia, the ancient wealth of Egypt, and eventually to the very heart of the Persian Empire itself. It was the day that a 23-year-old Macedonian king proved to the world, and perhaps most importantly to himself, that he possessed the skill, the courage, the ambition, and the divine favour to reshape the ancient world according to his own extraordinary vision. The road to Gaugamela, and to the title of the Great, began here in the bloody waters of the Pinarus River. If this incredible story of tactical genius and ancient warfare has captured your imagination, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's most fascinating battles. Share this video with anyone who loves military history or stories of against all odds victories. And let us know in the comments, do you think Darius's downfall was caused by his own arrogance, or was Alexander simply an unstoppable force of nature? Thanks for joining us on this journey through one of history's most decisive moments, and we'll see you in the next episode where we continue following Alexander's incredible conquest of the ancient world.